Hey guys, tonight we're sailing straight into the wild, wind-whipped world of the Vikings, not the helmet with horns caricature, but the gritty, frostbitten, axe-swinging reality. We're talking about what it was really like to build a longship in the freezing cold, wearing little more than a tunic and a serious amount of stubborn. Spoiler, they didn't have down parkas or heated workshops. Just grit, wood, and the occasional sheep bladder. But before we hoist the sail, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of brutally honest, slightly ridiculous history. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love knowing who's here at midnight and who's here at breakfast pretending they're not procrastinating. Now light a candle, grab a warm drink, or wrap yourself in a blanket, because what we're about to dive into is not cozy. The Viking world was not cute. It was soaked in seawater, smoke, and sheer determination. These were people who looked at a frozen fjord and thought, let's build a boat and sail across the ocean in it. Their lives were rough, their nights colder than your ex's heart, and their shipbuilding methods were, let's say, resourceful. From chopping trees with stone-cold hands to waterproofing a hull with animal fat, they turned back-breaking labor into world-changing mobility. So let's step back into the icy mornings, where frost clung to your beard and progress was measured in splinters and swears. This is what it was like to build a longship in the cold, with no pants and live to raid another day. The average modern morning begins with a groggy fumble for a snooze button and a half-hearted curse at the alarm clock, followed by a hot shower, a steaming cup of something caffeinated, and perhaps a moment of existential dread while staring at your phone. Now, take that routine, remove the electricity, remove the plumbing, remove the caffeine, and remove the phone, but leave the existential dread, because that still fits, and you're beginning to understand what it was like to wake up as a Viking. Imagine a morning where the first thing you feel isn't sunlight or a duvet, but your own frozen breath crusted on your mustache. Not a poetic morning frost, mind you, more of a why does my blanket crunch situation. There's no thermostat to argue over, no slippers to shuffle into, and certainly no heated floor. The floor is dirt. And it's not just cold, it's, if you dropped a chicken in the night, you might find it preserved like an ice sculpture, cold. Welcome to the Scandinavian morning, circa 900 AD, where survival wasn't just a theme, it was the entire point. Most Vikings didn't live in cozy longhouses with roaring fires and fur-draped everything. Those belonged to the chieftains, the wealthy, and the characters you read about in sagas. The average Norse family occupied what can best be described as a glorified smoke hut, long, rectangular, often shared with livestock, and built with the architectural ambition of keep the wind out, mostly. Insulation came in the form of thatch roofing, packed earth, and if you were lucky, some peat-stuffed walls that smelled faintly of swamp and sheep. Nights were brutal, especially in winter, which in Viking Scandinavia didn't politely arrive in December and depart in March. It loitered menacingly from October to May, sometimes June if it was in a mood. Vikings didn't count on sunshine to warm them up, because the sun didn't rise so much as it hovered, squinting over the horizon like it wasn't sure it wanted to be involved. And since your longhouse's single central hearth had likely burned low overnight to conserve firewood, morning warmth was something you earned with effort, or frostbite. The first to rise in a Viking household wasn't dad or mom or some early bird teen hoping to get ahead. It was probably the person who drew the short straw the night before, the unlucky soul assigned to crawl out of the communal sleeping heap, shivering in their wool tunic, and coax the fire back to life. If you've ever tried to start a fire in a freezing room, using damp kindling, with numb fingers, and no coffee, you can appreciate what a triumph that was. The matches hadn't been invented yet, obviously, so fire starting required flint, steel, and a kind of quiet, practiced desperation. If the embers were completely deadened, sometimes they were, because it turns out fire doesn't respond well to, let's just put a single log on and hope it lasts 8 hours. then you were back to square one. Sparks. Tinder. Blowing. Praying. And trying not to wake the entire family with the sound of your muttered curses. And then came the smoke. Viking longhouses didn't have chimneys. The smoke, from the central hearth, simply rose into the rafters and lingered, politely, suggesting it might leave eventually, but mostly just thickening the air into something you could chew. Early mornings meant coughing, squinting, and trying to avoid walking headfirst into low-hanging smoke clumps that made your eyes water like you'd just been told the Danegeld was due again. But there were upsides. Smoke, it turns out, has excellent secondary benefits. It discouraged bugs, it preserved food, it cured wood, and most importantly, it coated the inside of the home with a fine, sticky tar-like film that surely improved the flavor of anything stored nearby and possibly added 10 years to the life expectancy of the walls. If you think your landlord's paint job is shoddy, just remember, the Viking version was carbon-based and highly flammable. Once the fire was rekindled, the warmth began to crawl slowly outward from the hearth like a tired cat. The family, all of whom had been huddled together under rough wool blankets, animal skins, and whatever dignity remained, would begin to stir. Kids, elders, spouses, they emerged like reluctant bears from their winter den, stretching, sneezing, and hoping that someone had already started breakfast. Spoiler, probably not. Clothing, such as it was, did little to improve matters. The Vikings had a practical but limited wardrobe. For warmth, there were wool tunics and cloaks, some fur if you could afford it, and trousers if you were fortunate. But among certain working classes, especially during intense labor or inside smoky, heated spaces, pants weren't always worn. A tunic, belt, and thick leg wraps might be all that stood between your nether regions and the biting North Sea air. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was practicality with a side of boldness. Still, modesty wasn't exactly high on the Norse priority list. These were people who bathed once a week, making them the hygienic overachievers of early medieval European, who weren't afraid of a little exposed thigh if it meant less chafing while hauling logs or hammering planks. You didn't complain about the cold. You layered wool, drank hot broth, and told it to go raid someone else's village. Speaking of broth, breakfast was not the Instagram-worthy spread of fruits, grains, and French press coffee we indulge in today. A Viking breakfast was whatever you had: porridge made from barley or oats, reheated meat or fish, maybe some hard cheese and sour ale if you were lucky. This wasn't a meal so much as fuel, shoveled in to keep the internal fires going while the external ones caught up. And yet, despite all of this, the freezing air, the smoky homes, the hard beds, and the constant reminder that socks were a luxury not yet invented the Viking day, had a strange kind of order. You woke, you warmed, you fed yourself, and then you got to work. There were no paid sick days, no work-from-home privileges, and certainly no self-care Sundays. Survival was self-care, and it involved hauling logs, mending nets, feeding animals, and if you were especially ambitious, crafting a longship with nothing but hand tools and hope. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine Viking life as all battle cries and horned glory. But before the raids and the sagas came mornings like these slow, smoky, sore-back dawns where getting up was the hardest part of the day, and that was before you went out into the snow to chop timber. These were the unsung hours of Norse life, the behind-the-scenes grit that made the epic possible. Because you didn't just become the kind of person who sails across the North Sea in an open boat with no GPS and questionable pants. You earned it, one frozen morning at a time. And that's the part that modern life tends to forget, the heroics of discomfort, the quiet kind of toughness that doesn't show up in poetry or inscriptions. It's in the guy who gets up first to light the fire. It's in the mother who bundles her children in half-frozen furs and sends them to fetch water. It's in the child who learns that the world outside the longhouse is not warm, not fair, and not going to wait for them to adjust. So the next time you're tempted to groan about a chilly morning or complain that your socks didn't fully dry in the dryer, just remember, somewhere in the Scandinavian past, a man stood barefoot on frozen dirt, rubbing his hands together, eyeing a pile of firewood, and thinking, well, better get on with it. That ship isn't going to build itself. And then he did it, not because he wanted to, not because it was epic, but because cold or not, it had to be done. That's the real Viking spirit. No pants required. The thing about building a longship is that, first, you need a forest. Not a tidy little copse with dainty trees that sway poetically in the breeze, but a proper Scandinavian forest, thick, dark, stubborn, and ancient. You need trees with trunks wide enough to shame your dinner table and old enough to remember when your great-great-grandfather was still trying to figure out how to tie his belt. And once you find these noble, towering behemoths, you have to chop them down with an axe in winter. This was the Viking version of starting a project from scratch. No lumberyards, no chainsaws, no team of subcontractors with logo, emblazoned vans, and Spotify playlists. Just a man, an iron axe, and the quiet understanding that he was about to have the worst upper body workout of his life. Let's talk about the axe. Viking axes were not your local hardware store specials. They were forged with care, balanced for precision, and honed to terrifying sharpness. These weren't lumberjack showpieces. They were versatile, deadly tools used for everything from combat to kindling. And while most people today associate axes with splitting firewood or leaning decoratively against a log cabin wall, the Vikings saw them as all-purpose life facilitators. If it couldn't be solved with an axe, it probably involved too many vowels anyway. But chopping down a tree in 9th century Scandinavia wasn't just a matter of swinging wildly at the trunk and waiting for gravity to finish the job. It required strategy, skill, and a healthy disregard for personal safety. Trees didn't come with warning signs or fall neatly away from your campsite. You had to read the wood examine, the lean, the branch structure, the surrounding terrain, and guess which way it would fall. Then, standing knee-deep in snow or mud or both, you began to cut, and cut, and cut. The average tree selected for a longship keel was not small. Oak was the preferred material, strong, flexible, and resistant to rot, though pine and ash were also used, especially when oak was playing hard to get. To fell one tree suitable for a keel could take hours, even days, of back-breaking labor. There were no shortcuts. If your swing was weak or your aim poor, you were rewarded with splinters, not progress. The work was cold, noisy, and repetitive. Every strike echoed through the trees, a reminder that this was a task done not in silence, but in rhythm, like a grim percussion ensemble where the only instrument was suffering. And yet, there was beauty in the repetition, a kind of grim poetry. Each strike shaved the future into being, a rib of a ship, a plank, a frame. Every flake of bark torn loose was a step closer to the sea. If you think today's team-building retreats are tough, imagine bonding with your neighbors over frozen stumps and bloodied palms. This wasn't just a one-man job. Building a longship meant working in a group, which sounds lovely until you remember that everyone was tired, cold, and armed with axes. Disagreements weren't resolved by HR. They were worked out in the kind of terse silence only Scandinavians can master, or else by swinging harder until the argument became irrelevant. And yet, teamwork was essential. Some held wedges, others hauled branches. One unlucky soul might have been assigned to drag the heavy trunk over icy terrain to the shipyard, a task usually requiring ingenuity, sleds, ropes, and occasionally the patient willingness to wait for more snow. Because if you're going to pull a 2-ton log down a mountain slope, you might as well let physics help. The freshly cut timber had to be shaped quickly. Green woodwood, that's still full of sap, was easier to carve and bend, but it also cracked if left too long in the sun or cold. So the moment a tree hit the ground, the clock started ticking. It was hauled back to the village and propped up in the shipyard, a clearing that often doubled as an all-purpose workspace, social gathering spot, and daycare center, because Viking life rarely stopped for childcare. There, the real artistry began. Vikings didn't simply slap planks together and hope for the best. Longships were precise, elegant vessels designed to flex and glide across the waves like a sword through silk. Their shallow draft allowed for river travel. Their symmetrical ends made turning in tight spots look easy, and none of that happened by accident. Crafting a longship required a shipwright's touch, an intimate knowledge of wood grain, moisture content, tension, and balance. These weren't learned in a textbook. They were passed down by hand-scholauzed, experienced, and occasionally missing a few fingers from earlier lessons. The keel backbone of the ship was the first piece carved. It had to be strong enough to carry the entire weight of the vessel, but flexible enough to bend without snapping in heavy seas. Often, shipwrights sought trees with natural curves, especially for the prow and stern. If they couldn't find one, they shaped it painstakingly, bending the wood with heat and steam and a certain level of whispered pleading. The ribs, or frames, followed. These gave the ship its structure. Again, curved wood was ideal. Vikings were known to seek out trees that had grown in unusual shapes, be cliffs, over rocks, in coastal winds, anything that might give them the natural arc they needed. These organic shapes made the ship stronger and more efficient, like fitting puzzle pieces forged by nature itself. Then came the planks, split and carved with care, thinned to just the right width, and overlapped in the classic clinker building style. Each was fastened with iron, rivet-sheeted, hammered, and clenched by hand. Between each layer, wool or animal hair, soaked in tar, acted as caulking. The result? A hull that flexed with the waves, but didn't let the sea in, a crucial feature if you preferred not to die. And yet, for all this precision, the materials weren't glamorous. Tools were primitive by today's standards. Iron adzes, wooden mallets, wedges, and hammers. Measuring devices consisted of knotted cords and eyeballs. Templates were made of wood or bone. There were no laser levels or CAD software, just intuition and experience, both of which had to be earned the hard way. Even the smaller details had their quirks. Pegs made of birch bark, for instance, were often used in joinery because birch swells when wet, tightening the seal. It's one of those clever little tricks that makes you realize these people didn't just muscle their way through. They observed, adapted, and refined their craft with generations of accumulated wisdom. Still, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Mistakes happened. Timber split, planks warped, weather intervened. Sometimes a half-built keel sat unused for months because the men were called away to defend a border, hunt, or sail off to raid England for the 5th time that year. Shipbuilding wasn't always linear. It was often interrupted by life, war, or just the relentless demands of a brutal climate. And speaking of climate, the irony of working with wood in cold weather is that your fingers, the tools, and the material itself are all working against you. Steel becomes brittle, bark freezes. Sap oozes with the consistency of honey kept in a glacier. You need precision when your hands are stiff, your nose is running, and your breath keeps fogging up the spot you're trying to see. The wood doesn't care. It still expects respect. Yet perhaps the most brutal part of the timber process wasn't the labor or the cold. It was the patience. A single longship could take months to build. Not because of inefficiency, far from it, but because haste broke ships, and broken ships killed crews. You couldn't afford to rush when your life depended on the curves of the keel and the angle of the prow. So they worked carefully, intentionally, and sometimes obsessively. Even the wood itself had to be patient. Once shaped, timbers were sometimes left to rest, to adjust to the new tension and form. This prevented warping later and gave the builders a chance to spot imperfections. The ship grew not in a frenzy, but in slow, deliberate steps of sculpture, coaxed into being by frostbitten hands and relentless practicality. By the time the skeleton of the ship rose up from the dirt like some strange, antlered beast, it already bore the marks of 100 decisions, compromises, and personal touches. Every builder could see their work in the grain. Every axe stroke told a story. It wasn't just a boutique, it was a community project, in the truest sense, built by many, trusted by all. The trees that once stood tall in the forest now crouched low in the form of a vessel that promised motion, exploration, and danger in equal measure. Their rings counted centuries. Their hulls would soon count miles. It's easy to admire Viking ships for their sleek lines and formidable presence, but none of that happens without what came before. The freezing mornings, the felling, the carving, the cursing, the aching backs. The violence done to the forest was methodical, respectful even, not wasteful, not random. It was transformation. And if that transformation involved a few pine sap blisters and splinters in regrettable places, well, that was simply part of the rite. So the next time you admire a Viking longship on display in a museum, remember what it took to get there. Not just the raids and the voyages and the sagas, but the axe work in the snow, the hauling over frozen mud, the long hours spent staring at a curve of timber and wondering if it would hold. Because before they conquered coasts and rewrote history, the Vikings first had to conquer the trees. With iron, with grit, and maybe just a little bit of rage. There's a certain kind of person who takes pride in not wearing a coat when it's cold. We've all met one. They stride through the snow in a t-shirt, exhaling smug little clouds of superiority, muttering something about building resilience or Nordic blood. Now imagine that person, but in a tunic, barefoot, holding an axe, and trying to caulk a longship in a snowstorm. Welcome to Viking fashion, a relentless, wool-wrapped negotiation with nature, modesty, and the cruel reality that leather pants freeze just as fast as your dignity. Let's start with the obvious. Vikings didn't have Patagonia, or Gore-Tex, or zippers. They had wool, animal hides, and whatever parts of a sheep weren't already being used as dinner or insulation. Their clothing wasn't designed for style. It was designed for survival. And even then, survival was often a best-case scenario. Your average Viking wasn't strutting into battle looking like a casting call for a Norse drama. He was trudging through knee-deep slush in a tunic that probably hadn't seen a proper wash since last harvest, muttering dark thoughts about the livestock that stole his only cloak. The basic Viking outfit was utilitarian, minimalist, and layered with the kind of practicality that says, I don't care how I look, I care whether I freeze to death before lunch. The standard male ensemble started with a woolen undertunic, a kind of scratchy, sweat-absorbing barrier between skin and everything else. Over that came a heavier overtunic, also wool, and usually dyed in whatever color could be wrung out of local plant sif. You were lucky, brown. If you were unlucky, also brown, just in a different shade. Pants were worn, yes, but not always. In labor-intensive settings, particularly among lower-class craftsmen and shipbuilders, trousers were sometimes ditched entirely in favor of leg wraps, tunics, and a cheerful disregard for shame. That's right, no pants, or more specifically, no trousers in the way we think of them. Instead, men often wrapped strips of wool or linen around their lower legs known as winningers or leg bindings, which provided warmth, protection, and maybe just enough decency to keep communal living from getting awkward. Combine that with a long tunic, and you've essentially got the Viking version of a bathrobe and compression socks. Functional? Yes. Flattering? Not even remotely. But here's the twist. It worked. These garments weren't stitched together by amateurs with a Pinterest board. They were the result of centuries of adaptation. Wool was the real MVP of the Viking wardrobe. It was abundant, water-resistant, insulating even when wet, and capable of soaking up enough smoke from the hearth to make moths gag. Vikings understood that staying warm wasn't about being stylish, it was about being clever. A good tunic woven tight and layered thick, could stand up to sleet, wind, and the occasional rogue hailstone. Still, even the best wool has limits. And when those limits were reached, say, during a blizzard, or while standing waist-deep in seawater, patching a ship's hull, animal hides came into play. Cloaks, made of fur or thick leather, were thrown over shoulders, fastened with brooches or cords, and worn like shields against the cold. These weren't tailored fashion pieces, they were glorified blankets with ambition, but they worked. Sealskin, bear pelts, and reindeer hide all served their part in keeping Norse bodies marginally above freezing. As for footwear, well, let's just say expectations were low. Viking shoes were basic leather, turnshoe soft-soled, flexible, and about as waterproof as a handshake. They worked fine in dry weather, but in mud or snow, they soaked through in minutes. Some were stuffed with straw or moss for extra insulation, which sounds rustic and charming until you consider that you were basically composting inside your own boots. Socks, when worn, were made of wool or felt, often hand-stitched and periodically sacrificed to the gods of frostbite. And yet, somehow, this whole ramshackle system worked, not because it was warm but because the people inside it were. Vikings didn't dress for comfort, they dressed for battle, against the cold, against the wind, and occasionally against each other. Clothing was armor against the environment, not the catwalk. If your tunic covered your bits and didn't fall apart when wet, you were good to go. If it happened to be dyed a nice reddish blue from crushed berries, that was just a bonus. Of course, if you had status chieftain, trader, someone who didn't have to stand in icy puddles for a living, your wardrobe improved accordingly. Wealthier Vikings wore layered outfits of finer wool, linen undergarments, and cloaks trimmed in fur or decorated with tablet-woven bands. Jewelry wasn't just for show, either. Brooches, pins, and belt buckles were practical fasteners, and also functioned as portable status symbols. In a world where your worth wasn't stored in a bank, it was worn on your person, preferably in bronze, silver, or gold. Women's clothing was a bit more structured, and dare we say, slightly warmer. The basic outfit included a linen underdress, a woolen overdress or apron dress, known as a hangrock, and shoulder straps held together by brooches. The result was a kind of wearable fortress of layered fabric, ornamented with beads, keys, and small personal items that dangled from the brooches like medieval charm bracelets. It was functional, expressive, and critically designed for movement, work, and child wrangling in sub-zero temperatures. But even with all these layers, Viking clothing was never a perfect solution. Cold seeped in through seams, rain turned wool into sponges, wind found every gap and made itself at home. And snow, that ever-present character in the Norse drama, had a habit of sticking to cloaks like glitter to carpet unshakable and omnipresent. Getting dressed in the morning wasn't about looking good. It was about accepting your fate, and hoping today wouldn't involve prolonged exposure to the North Atlantic. There were no fashion trends in the Viking Age, no seasonal collections. The only relevant season was winter, and it lasted for most of the year. You didn't swap out your wardrobe, you added to it. One more tunic, one more cloak, one more layer between you and the uncaring sky. If your clothing started to fray or tear, you patched it. If it fell apart, you unraveled it and reused the thread. Waste was a luxury no one could afford, especially when every stitch might be the difference between frostbite and frostnip. And yet, Vikings didn't complain, not out loud anyway. They simply endured. It was baked into their worldview. You didn't whine about the cold, you adapted. You didn't bemoan the lack of socks, you wrapped your legs tighter and kept moving. And if your knee-length tunic left your thighs exposed to the wind, you simply gritted your teeth and thought about all the places you'd rather be, like a warm longhouse, or literally anywhere south of Denmark. If you think your drafty apartment is bad, try living in a wooden hut with gaps in the walls, a ceiling made of thatch, and a roommate who stores pickled fish under the floorboards. That's not hyperbole, it's Tuesday. Clothing was the only thing standing between you and the elements, which is why Vikings treated it not as decoration, but as survival gear. Still, there's a kind of dignity in the simplicity, in the restraint. Viking clothing wasn't about ornamentation, it was about functionality. It didn't try to impress, it didn't try to elevate. It tried to protect, and in doing so, it told the story of a people who faced down ice and wind and freezing sea spray with nothing more than wool, willpower, and an indifference to pants that bordered on heroic. Because the truth is, no one ever built a longship in silk robes. No one stood at the prow of a dragon-headed vessel, braving the sleet and salt, while wearing satin. The garments of the Norse were as blunt, stubborn, and enduring as the people who wore them. They weren't soft, they weren't warm, they weren't particularly comfortable. But they got the job done. And maybe that's the point. In a world where every day was a challenge, every meal was earned, and every breath of warm air was a small victory, you didn't need couture. You needed courage. You needed layers. And occasionally, you needed to accept that you were going to spend the next 4 hours hauling timber in a tunic, with nothing but leg wraps and questionable choices covering your dignity. And you'd do it again, tomorrow. Because that's what Vikings did. No pants, no problem. There is a moment in every handmade project, be it furniture, a treehouse, or a lovingly botched DIY coffee table, when the builder pauses, looks at their work, and mutters something unrepeatable under their breath. Now imagine that, but instead of pine from a hardware store, you're staring down the gnarled curve of a half-ton oak plank, in freezing wind, with a hand-forged adze and a deadline determined by whether the ice thaws before your enemies invade. Welcome to the elegant chaos of Longship hull construction. In theory, carving a ship hull sounds noble, poetic even, a dance between man and wood, the shaping of a sea-born creature from raw forest bones. In practice, it's more like a violent, splinter-rich negotiation that involves bleeding knuckles, meticulous craftsmanship, and an alarming amount of shouting, mostly at the timber, occasionally at the sky, and frequently at one another. The Longship, despite what museum lighting and modern reconstructions might suggest, was not born out of serene workshops and gentle whittling. It was forged in hard labor by men who had zero access to power tools and very limited patience for nonsense. What made these ships remarkable was not just how fast or flexible they were, but how anyone managed to make them at all under the circumstances. At the center of this miracle was the hull, sleek, shallow, and terrifyingly light for something that could carry 40 men and a cargo of sheep. The Longship hull was a masterclass in controlled curves and calculated strength. But achieving that shape, those graceful, hydrodynamic lines, meant bending nature to your will with nothing but iron, sweat, and years of hard-earned expertise. It all began with the keel, the spine of the ship. We've covered the agony of chopping down the trees for it, but now came the part where the timber was carved into a precise, slightly curved beam that would support everything else. It needed to flex without breaking, endure pressure without warping, and serve as the skeletal base for the ship's entire personality. And because this was Viking Scandinavia, that meant working with wood that had probably been frozen for half the year and was now reluctantly thawing into something between firm flesh and reluctant concrete. The keel was usually made of oak, if available, because oak had the kind of dense, fibrous character that said, "I will not splinter under pressure," which, when you're crossing the North Sea, is exactly what you want. Shaping it meant painstakingly, planing and shaving until the wood formed a slight upward arc, a subtle curve that would give the ship its speed and agility. This wasn't decorative. It was essential. A flat keel rides like a bathtub. A curved one slices water like a blade. Now, this is where the shouting really began. Because once the keel was laid, everything else had to match it. The stem and stern, posts, those dramatic upright timbers that formed the ends of the ship, had to be mortised into the keel, with joints tight enough to hold during both a storm and a battle. And doing that with hand tools was less gentle carpentry and more coaxing a reluctant god into a wooden hinge. If you've ever tried to fit two warped pieces of IKEA furniture together with a dowel and a prayer, you understand the mood. With the skeleton complete, the builders moved on to the planking rows of long, overlapping boards that gave the ship its strength, structure, and personality. These were carved one by one, shaped with axes and draw knives, then hammered into place with iron rivets, and clenched from the inside with roves, metal washers, essentially. Each board had to follow the curve of the hull exactly, bending not just in one direction, but often two or three, because water, annoyingly, does not respect straight lines. This technique, known as clinker building or lap-straight construction, involved overlapping the edges of the planks like shingles on a roof. The result was a flexible, lightweight hull that could bend with the waves rather than fight them. It was also, to put it mildly, a nightmare to get right. Every plank had to be carved to taper just so. Every overlap had to fit flush. Every rivet had to be perfectly aligned with its counterpart inside the ship, where someone, usually the apprentice, had to crawl into the hull with a hammer and take the blows like a medieval metal piñata. Let's take a moment to appreciate what that apprentice's day looked like. Inside the hull, surrounded by a maze of half-fastened wood, he would lie on his back, barely able to move, while someone outside hammered iron rivets through two planks and expected him to hold the rove in place with tongs. The noise was deafening, the dust was suffocating, and the cold iron occasionally slipped and smacked him in the face. All this so the ship wouldn't leak. Apprenticeships weren't glamorous, they were hazing with a job title. And then came the steaming. Wood doesn't bend easily unless it's encouraged. Encouragement, in this case, meant steam. Vikings would place stubborn planks in troughs or pits, cover them with wet cloth or moss, and pour boiling water over them. Sometimes they'd build a tent around the plank and use heated stones to create a cloud of steam thick enough to make a Roman bathhouse jealous. Once pliable, the wood could be bent into the necessary curve and held there with clamps or ropes, or wedges, or, failing all else, brute force and collective panic. There were no industrial clamps or jigs. There were props, stakes, heavy rocks, extra bodies leaning at just the right angle. Bending a plank was a communal act, like a barn raising, only with more chances of splinters in delicate places. And because these ships had to be symmetrical, the process had to be repeated, mirrored, and adjusted for every side, down to the inch. If one side bulged out more than the other, you didn't get a Viking longship, you got a very confident canoe. Caulking the seams was another exercise in tactile suffering. The overlapping planks were sealed using a mixture of wool, moss, or animal hair, soaked in pine terone of history's more underrated adhesives, and also a smell that probably haunted Norse dreams. Tar was applied hot, often with gloved hands or crude brushes, and it got everywhere. Your clothes, your beard, the soles of your feet if you weren't careful. It smoked, stank, and left a permanent mark on everything it touched. But it worked. A properly tarred hull didn't just float, it sang in the water. By this point in construction, the ship had taken shape, a skeletal, tar-covered, smoke-scented masterpiece. But it wasn't ready yet. Not without the strakes, the horizontal support timbers that helped lock the planks together. Not without the deck beams, the oar holes, the benches, and the mast step. Each required exact measurements, careful placement, and the kind of on-the-fly engineering that you only develop after decades of fixing things with what you have and calling it good enough. And yet, good enough, in Viking shipbuilding, still meant excellence. These ships weren't flukes. They were the result of a system, a tradition of craftsmanship passed from master to apprentice, father to son, over centuries. The knowledge wasn't written down. It was lived, spoken, shown. Every hull carried within it not just the wood from the forest, but the minds of those who shaped it, the hands that hammered it, the arguments that decided whether a curve was too steep or a plank too thick. The Longship didn't just look fast. It was. With its light build and shallow keel, it could move quickly in open seas and slip up rivers where heavier ships wouldn't dare. Its balance allowed it to be rowed with precision and speed, and its flexibility meant it could absorb impact from waves that would crack a stiffer hull. But none of that was accidental. Every line, every nail, every curved board was part of a larger philosophy. Mobility, above all. Build fast, move fast, be gone before the smoke clears. That elegance, of course, came at a price. Time, labor, pain. You don't carve curves by accident, you earn them. With hours of adjusting, recutting, reshaping, reheating, with tools that bit back, with wood that refused to cooperate, with builders who shouted, cursed, drank, and then went back to work. The swearing, to be clear, wasn't a side effect, it was part of the process. Like seasoning a pan, the ship absorbed the mood of its makers. And so, from that crucible of sawdust and smoke, the hull emerged, slender, sinewed, ready. It didn't look like much at first, resting on its wooden props in a muddy yard, surrounded by iron scraps and exhausted men. But when it finally slid into the water, the noise stopped. For a moment, there was no yelling, no hammering, no argument about plank spacing, just the gentle slap of waves against a hull that had taken shape through stubborn will and ancient skill. The Longship was alive, in a sense, not just a vessel, but a memory of the trees it once was, of the hands that shaped it, of the mistakes made and the lessons learned. It was the product of people who didn't believe in shortcuts, who measured their progress in splinters and swore accordingly. Because in the end, shaping something extraordinary out of the ordinary is never a quiet process. It requires noise, it requires labor, and yes, it definitely requires yelling. Let's face it, most people, when thinking about Viking shipbuilding, imagine a heroic seam-bearded craftsman bathed in golden torchlight, solemnly carving elegant ships, with wisdom in their eyes, and possibly a raven perched nearby for aesthetic purposes. What they don't picture, and really should, is the less glamorous truth. Someone up to their elbows in animal intestines, trying to make a rope that won't snap in a storm, while cursing a bent iron nail that just snapped in half and ruined 2 days' worth of careful planking. Because for all the romance of Viking longships, the actual construction was held together by a surprisingly intimate relationship with iron, wool, and whatever was left of the nearest goat. This is the story of Viking hardware, not the part you admire from a distance in a museum, but the sticky, smoky, hand-forged, blood-slick reality. Building a longship wasn't just about carpentry and courage. It was about making every single fastening element, every nail, peg, and coil of rope be hand with raw materials, while your fingers slowly forgot what warmth felt like. Viking ingenuity wasn't just about raiding far-off shores. It was about figuring out how to stitch a warship together with minimal tools and a shocking tolerance for pungent organic substances. Let's start with the nails. The humble iron nail is one of history's most underappreciated inventions. For the Vikings, it wasn't just useful, it was essential. And unlike the modern version, which comes in neat little boxes at hardware stores, Viking nails were a point of pride, effort, and no small amount of pain. They were forged one by blacksmiths, who labored over open fires with hand-operated bellows, and the kind of commitment that only comes from knowing you can't build a ship with good intentions and splinters. Each nail began as an iron rod, heated until it glowed like the setting sun, and then pounded into shape on an anvil with a hammer that had probably been passed down from someone with impressive forearms and a personality forged in equal parts soot and sarcasm. The nails were then flattened at one end to form a head, sharpened at the other, and cooled. There were no machines to churn out identical piecevery. Nail was unique. Not in a charming, artisan way, but in a slightly worrisome, let's hope this one doesn't shear under pressure way. These were clenched nails, which means they weren't just driven in, they were hammered through the overlapping planks and then bent over on the inside, forming a rivet-like seal with a washer, or rove, to keep it all in place. It was a two-person job, one poor soul on the outside with a hammer, the other curled up inside the hull, holding an iron block and praying his fingers stayed attached. The sound of iron on iron echoed through the shipyard, an endless chorus of sharp clangs and muffled grunts. It was the Viking version of background music, and it lasted for weeks. But nails weren't the only game in town. Pegs often made from hard woods like oak or birch were also driven through joints to secure parts of the hull without cracking them. These were cheaper, lighter, and didn't rust, but they had a nasty habit of swelling unpredictably when wet, which made them perfect for waterproofing, but potentially catastrophic if misaligned. It required precise craftsmanship, careful fitting, and a willingness to redo the same joint 5 times until it stopped leaking or someone lost patience and declared it close enough. Then there was rope, and here's where things really got intimate. Modern rope is clean, uniform, and smells vaguely of hardware store. Viking rope, by contrast, was handmade from natural fibers, mostly twisted animal hair, wool, or bast fibers, from plants like flax or nettle. But in harsher conditions, when supplies were short or urgency outweighed aesthetics, rope might be made from dried animal intestines, or even rawhide. Yes, intestines, as in, formerly part of a goat's digestive tract, now repurposed as a tension-bearing structural element. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And it tells you something about the Viking mindset, that the line between livestock and ship part was often disturbingly thin. To make rope, fibers were twisted together into long, sinuous strands and then plied into thicker cords. This process, called spinning, was done by hand or with a simple spindle. It required patience, rhythm, and more upper arm strength than anyone would comfortably admit. Viking rope was usually 3-stranded and laid in an S or Z twist, depending on the application. Sail ropes, anchor lines, and lashings all demanded different thicknesses and strengths, and each had to be made with an understanding that the ocean did not accept excuses. The final ropes weren't always smooth or pretty, but they held. And in a storm, when your sail is flapping like a banshee and your oarsmen are soaked and swearing, you don't care how your rope looks, you care that it doesn't snap and send your mast flying into the fjord. Speaking of sails, those required yet another kind of rope work. Viking sails were typically made from woven wool, reinforced at the edges with additional stitching and cords to prevent fraying. The process of making a single sail could take months and involved everything from shearing sheep to spinning, dyeing, weaving, and finally stitching the massive woolen rectangle into something that wouldn't shred the moment the wind hit. The sail ropes used for hoisting, trimming, and reefing were anchored to blocks and tackle made of wood, bone, or antler. Every knot had to hold. Every loop had to slide without jamming. It was a symphony of friction and tension, performed in rain, wind, and the occasional snowstorm. And still, the shipbuilders weren't done. To further waterproof the hull, the seams between planks were caulked with a mixture of animal hair and pine tar. Pine tar is one of those substances that sounds benign until you've smelled it. It's thick, sticky, black as despair, and smells like someone tried to barbecue a Christmas tree while burning a leather couch. But it worked. The tar was boiled in large vats, usually in open fire pits that doubled as bonfires and hazard sand, brushed or smeared into the seams with wooden spatulas, gloved hands, or sheer reckless enthusiasm. The result was a sealant that repelled water, discouraged rot, and ensured that no matter how rough the voyage, the hull would remain watertight, at least until something gave way in a storm, and everyone began bailing with carved wooden bowls and existential dread. Even the rudder, that noble, asymmetrical steering board, attached to the starboard side, a term that literally comes from steerboard, was lashed on with heavy-duty rope and occasionally reinforced with iron fittings. The placement had to be exact, too low, and it dragged awkwardly, too high, and steering became theoretical. There were no wheels, just a tiller along, stiff handle extending from the top, manipulated by whoever drew the short straw, and stood exposed to the weather for the entire trip. In fact, most Viking ship hardware came with a dual purpose: secure the vessel and test the limits of human patience. Blocks cracked, ropes frayed, nails bent. And every failure was a potential disaster. There were no backups, no toolkits labeled just in case. If something snapped at sea, you fixed it. You learned how to row in a circle for the next week. Redundancy wasn't a luxury. It was something you built into your materials, or, more often, into your attitude. And yet, for all the discomfort, for all the smoky tar, the clumsy nails, the itchy wool ropes, it worked. Viking longships weren't flukes. They were masterpieces of practical engineering, held together by centuries of trial and error, by traditions passed down through gritted teeth and silent nods. The hardware wasn't flashy, but it was brilliant in its own relentless way. Every nail was a testament to fire and hammer, every rope a record of hands that spun through winter nights. Every tar-sealed seam a quiet promise: we float because we know how to sink. Today, we marvel at their elegance, the long curves, the fierce dragon heads, the speed with which they crossed oceans. But the real miracle was in the bits we don't see, the hidden rivets, the knotted cords, the soaked wool that wrapped the masthead. The invisible craft of people who looked at trees and goats and pine resin and thought, we can make a ship from this, and then did. So, the next time you admire a Viking longship, remember what's holding it together. Not just wood and iron, but a level of commitment that included boiling tar at midnight and repurposing intestines into maritime hardware. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, but by Odin, it was effective. If you've ever tried to assemble IKEA furniture without instructions, you know the special kind of frustration that comes from not knowing whether what you're doing is genius or madness. Now imagine that, but instead of a bookcase, it's a 30-ton warship, and instead of screws and particle board, you're working with tar, wool, sheep fat, and the crushing certainty that if you get it wrong, your boat will sink, instantly, in freezing water, with you on it. That, in essence, is Viking waterproofing. Long before synthetic sealants and marine-grade epoxy were even concepts, Norse shipbuilders had to answer one very unromantic but critical question. How do we keep the ocean on the outside of the boat? It's not the kind of question that gets carved into rune stones, but for the Viking Age seafarer, it was everything. A leak wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. You could have the most beautifully carved dragon prow and the fastest hull ever shaped, but if water seeped through your planks mid-voyage, you might as well have set sail in a colander. So how did they do it? With an odd combination of practicality, creativity, and a stomach-churning tolerance for animal byproducts. The Viking approach to waterproofing was less science and more very determined folk wisdom. It involved materials that were readily available, highly flammable, and almost universally pungent. The big three: pine tar, sheep fat, and smoke. If you're already recoiling at the smell, congratulations. You're halfway to understanding what life in a Norse shipyard was like. Let's begin with pine tar, MVP of Viking ship sealing. Pine tar, also known as wood tar, or the smell that never leaves your clothes, is produced through a slow-burning process called destructive distillation. You take a heap of pine roots, stumps, or logs, bury them in a kiln or pit, limit oxygen, and heat the whole thing until the sap oozes out in a sticky black resin. This is not a clean process. It is not tidy. It does not smell nice. It's the kind of task you assign to someone who's already lost their sense of smeller, perhaps as a rite of passage. The result, however, is impressive. A waterproof, antibacterial, insect-repelling goo that can be smeared into hull seams and over planks to protect against moisture and decay. Tar doesn't just coat wood, it soaks into it, preserving it from the inside out. When applied correctly, it seals gaps, keeps out rot, and makes the entire boat smell like a bonfire gone terribly wrong. Tar was so essential to Viking life that they didn't just make it, they traded it. Tar pits have been found all across Scandinavia, often accompanied by blackened earth, discarded staves, and the faint suggestion that nobody involved in the process ever got those clothes clean again. Now, if pine tar was the sealing agent, sheep fat was the secret weapon. Fat, or tallow, was rendered from animal carcasses, usually sheep or cowsby, slowly heating the meat and bones until the greasy, waxy substance separated. Vikings didn't waste much, and fat was used for everything from candles to soap to lubrication of tools, not egos. But it was also used in waterproofing mixed with tar, rubbed into ropes, smeared onto leather, and occasionally applied directly to wooden surfaces to create a more flexible, less brittle seal. Why fat? Because it's hydrophobic. It repels water, and in a world where chemical engineering consisted mostly of try it and see if it kills us, that was good enough. Fat could be rubbed into caulking, typically animal hair, moss, or wool, jammed between overlapping plankstow, create a soft, greasy barrier that moved with the wood and helped prevent cracking under pressure. It also had the side effect of turning the lower interior of a ship into a petting zoo-themed sauna, especially during long voyages. But again, the goal wasn't comfort, it was flotation. Then there was smoke. At first glance, this might seem out of place, but smoke curing was essential in both wood preservation and daily life. Viking longhouses were often built without chimneys, not because they hadn't thought of it, but because they wanted the smoke. It lingered under the thatch, coating beams and walls, with a layer of tarry residue that preserved the wood and discouraged mold, bugs, and any visiting relatives who couldn't handle the air quality. Similarly, in shipbuilding, smoke was sometimes used to pre-treat wood, especially during the drying process. By suspending timbers over slow-burning fires, builders could extract moisture gradually while saturating the wood with preservative compounds from the smoke. This didn't just dry the wood, it toughened it. Think of it like slow cooking a plank until it's less likely to betray you in a storm. And much like smoked meat, smoked wood kept longer and resisted decay better than its raw counterparts. Add these elements together, tar, fat, smoke, and you begin to see how the Viking Longship, as sleek and agile as it appeared on the water, was actually a floating chemistry experiment. Every part of the hull was engineered through trial and error, refined over generations, and held together not just by wood and nails, but by an evolving understanding of how to keep wood alive in a hostile, salt-soaked world. This process, of course, was messy. Waterproofing a ship wasn't a one-and-done affair. It was ongoing maintenance. Tar wore off, caulking shifted, fat dried out. After each voyage, or sometimes during, if a leak made itself known in an especially aggressive way, crew members would reapply sealant wherever it was needed. This could mean daubing hot tar onto the hull from inside the boat, while at sea, in high winds, using a bucket, a ladle, and a deep sense of self-loathing. And if you've never tried to aim a ladle of molten resin at a seam while the deck heaves beneath you like a drunk ox, consider yourself lucky. For those staying on land, re-tarring a ship was a communal effort. The boat would be pulled up on the beach or set into a cradle of logs. Fires would be lit, tar would be boiled, and a team of shipwrights, often, including farmers and fishermen, recruited by necessity, would slather the entire vessel in layer upon glistening, reeking layer of preservative. It was hard work, dangerous in its own right, and required a sort of cheerful fatalism about burns, blisters, and the possibility of setting the entire operation ablaze. And yet, it worked. Viking ships endured. They traveled thousands of miles down Russian rivers, across the Baltic, over the North Sea, even as far as the Mediterranean and the coasts of North America. They did this not because they were indestructible, but because the people who built and maintained them knew every weakness. Every plank was a compromise between speed and strength. Every seal, a dance between nature and human stubbornness. It's easy to forget, today, what a miracle waterproofing really was. We take dry feet for granted. We buy raincoats and expect them to work. We board ferries and assume the hull won't leak. But in the Viking world, staying dry was a full-time jawbone that required endless vigilance, endless effort, and an intimate familiarity with the least glamorous parts of an animal. And here's the irony. For all its mess, its smell, its risk, Viking waterproofing was wildly effective. It kept hulls afloat, holds dry, and reputations intact. It allowed Norsemen to project power far beyond their farms and fjords, to raid and trade across vast distances, and to return home with stories that would echo through the centuries. Not bad for a process that involved boiling tree guts and rubbing mutton grease into timber. So the next time you step onto a shipper, frankly, into a well-sealed bathtub spare, a thought for the people who got there first. The ones who didn't have silicone caulk or marine varnish, but who figured out, through sheer necessity, how to bend nature to their will. Who made the unforgiving seas just a little more survivable, one ladle of pine tar at a time. Because in the end, staying afloat isn't about the glory, it's about the gunk. And the Vikings knew that better than anyone. Building a longship on the bitter shores of 9th century Scandinavia wasn't just a triumph of engineering, it was a feat of caloric endurance. You try hauling timber, bending planks, hammering rivets, and smearing molten pine tar while wrapped in wool and frozen resolve, and you'll quickly discover that even the most legendary shipbuilders were basically powered by stew, dried fish, and stubbornness. Welcome to the Viking shipyard. Feastless, Michelin-starred banquet, more strategic shoveling of whatever wouldn't kill you. But if you're imagining a bleak, joyless procession of gruel and regrets, you'd only be half right. The food was humble, yes, but it was also hearty, inventive, and occasional accidentally delicious. Let's be clear from the start. Nobody building a longship had time for garnish. Presentation was not a priority. Most meals were eaten hunched over a wooden bowl, squatting on a log, or standing near a fire with a spoon in one hand and a crust of barley bread in the other. It was survival cuisine, built not around flavor profiles but function. Feed the muscles, warm the bones, and remind the soul that life, despite all evidence, wasn't completely terrible. At the center of this diet was dried fish. If Viking shipbuilding had a mascot, it would not be a noble warrior or majestic sail. It would be a leathery, salt-stiffened fillet of cod, hanging on a rack and aging like a barnacle-encrusted wine. Known as stockfish, this was cod air-dried, until it achieved a texture somewhere between wood and punishment. But it was brilliant. Properly dried, stockfish could last for years without spoiling an edible time capsule, ready whenever you needed protein that doubled as a projectile. Stockfish didn't need refrigeration. It didn't rot. It didn't care about snow, heat, humidity, or neglect. It was the ideal food for builders who didn't want their lunch to walk off in the night. Of course, it required a bit of coaxing to make it edible. You couldn't just gnaw on it straight off the drying rack unless you were trying to impress someone or lose a tooth. It had to be soaked, pounded, boiled, or all three. But once softened, it could be turned into stews, shredded into porridge, or mashed with butter and onions until it resembled something vaguely cheerful. And the Vikings, in their tireless practicality, made peace with it. Stockfish became a staple not just because it was available, but because it got the job done. It fed crews, fueled labor, and survived long enough to make itself indispensable. It was the glue that held the menu and, sometimes, your digestive system together. But the Viking diet didn't begin and end with fish mummies. Grains played a major role, especially barley, rye, and oats. Bread was dense, flat, and brownless of a loaf, more of a compact energy bar forged in a communal oven or baked on hot stones beside a fire. It wasn't fluffy, but it was filling. Barley porridge was another mainstay, a thick, gluey mass that could be sweetened with berries or drowned in meat drippings, depending on what was available and how badly you wanted to pretend it was different from yesterday. Meat was present, though not always plentiful. Sheep, goats, and pigs were the most common sources, with cattle reserved more for status or festivals. Shipwrights might snack on dried sausage, roasted scraps, or chunks of boiled meat floating in soup. And let's be honest, nothing says working-class Viking brunch like a bowl of lukewarm mutton stew shared with 6 other men who haven't washed their tunics since the equinox. Wild game supplemented the diet when possible: deer, elk, and the occasional bird, though catching it meant taking time away from ship construction. So unless someone's cousin was an overzealous hunter or a rabbit had the misfortune of wandering into the shipyard, it was mostly domesticated fare. Eggs, when not too precious to spare, added variety. Chickens were useful, but they were also noisy and prone to wandering off, so eggs came with a side of patience. Dairy products were common, but had a short shelf life, especially in summer. Skyr, a cultured milk product somewhere between yogurt and cheese, was popular, tangy, rich in protein, and versatile. Cheese came in hard, portable forms that aged well and could be added to meals or hoarded like edible treasure. Butter, when available, was a prized addition, used to soften dried bread, grease cooking pans, or bribe small children into not stealing your sausage. And then there were the vegetables, those noble, underwhelming side characters in the Viking culinary saga. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions held up well through cold months, often forming the base of stews and broths. Cabbage, leeks, and wild greens added what passed for color and nutrition. These were not glamour ingredients, but they were dependable, earthy, and honest like the Vikings themselves. For flavor, herbs and wild spices were foraged: dill, mustard seed, angelica, and juniper berries. Salt was essential and sometimes hard to come by, especially inland. When in short supply, the solution was simple: tolerate the blandness and complain quietly into your broth. Vinegar and honey were used sparingly, either to preserve or sweeten, but more often they were destined for the brewing kettle, because nothing got you through a hard day like ale. Ah, yes, the ale. Water, as you may know, is famously good at hiding illness in pre-modern societies. It looks innocent, but it harbors bacteria like a gossip-loving innkeeper. So the Vikings did what most medieval cultures did. They drank ale. Low-alcohol beer was brewed regularly and consumed by everyone, including children, because it was safer than raw water, and let's face it, marginally more cheerful. It also helped soften dried bread, dull the edges of monotony, and provide that crucial boost of morale when your morning task involved hauling tar barrels in the sleet. Mead, the honey-based cousin of ale, was more precious, stronger, sweeter, and usually reserved for special occasions. In a shipyard, mead might appear to mark a completed keel, a berth, or a particularly successful day of not dropping the mast. It wasn't daily fare, but it reminded everyone that life had its rewards, even if they tasted like fermented bees. Cooking, as you might expect, was done over open fires or in fire pits, with suspended pots, hot stones, or simple iron griddles. Meals were made in batches, shared communally, and eaten with wooden spoons or bare hands. There were no forks. Plates were often wooden or ceramic, and sometimes just hunks of bread that doubled as edible dishware. The result was a kind of functional camaraderie. You ate what was made, when it was made, and you didn't complain unless you wanted to start a conversation about whose turn it was to feed the goats. And in all of this, through the stew and stockfish, The porridge and beer there was something more than sustenance happening. There was community. There was rhythm. There was the steady, everyday alchemy of turning raw ingredients into energy, warmth, and progress. Meals weren't just pauses between work, they were part of the work, part of the ecosystem that kept the shipyard humming. Food fueled the muscles, but it also soothed the nerves, settled the moods, and reminded the builders that even in the face of cold, smoke, and splinters, there was still something worth looking forward to at the end of the day. It's tempting to romanticize the Viking feasto, imagine roaring fires, overflowing horns of ale, and songs echoing into the icy night. And those moments did exist, especially during festivals, seasonal gatherings, and the celebration of a completed ship. But most days, the feast was humble. It was a spoonful of turnip stew that didn't taste like last week's. It was warm bread from a shared oven. It was dried fish that didn't need soaking because someone remembered to do it the night before. It was enough. Enough to build with, enough to laugh through, enough to live on. Because in the Viking shipyard, survival didn't just mean staying alive, it meant staying fed, staying moving, and when the stew was hot and the wind was calm, maybe even staying a little happy. If you've ever been part of a group projectone of those legendary academic disasters, where two people do the work, one offers moral support, and one disappears entirely, you may think you understand the challenges of communal labor. But that's only because you've never tried to build a Viking longship with a crew of frostbitten farmers, one good axe, and exactly zero room for ego. Because in 9th century Scandinavia, teamwork wasn't about synergy or motivational posture. It was about not freezing to death with a half-finished hull and a community wondering why the gods were punishing them with splinters and setbacks. The longship, for all its sleek menace and streamlined beauty, wasn't the result of individual genius. It was a community endeavor, a group performance built not on applause, but on coordination, sweat, and the kind of grim cooperation that emerges when survival depends on how well you and your neighbor can carry a 20-foot oak beam without arguing about who's not pulling their weight. And while modern team building exercises might involve obstacle courses and trust falls, Viking collaboration was more about hauling, hammering, and managing not to kill each other before the keel was in place. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: no one built a longship alone. The sagas may celebrate lone warriors and rugged independence, but when it came to actually crafting the boat that would carry those warriors to glory or an early grave, it took a village, quite literally. The shipyard was less a workplace and more a seasonal migrationer, temporary, wood-choked encampment filled with craftsmen, farmers on break from their fields, apprentices trying not to get yelled at, and elders who mostly supervised from a safe distance while muttering advice no one asked for. The labor wasn't divided by job title, but by necessity. There was no union of professional tar boilers or certified plank benders. Instead, you had Hrolf, who was good with an axe, and Bjorn, who had a bad knee, but knew how to heat pine resin without setting his beard on fire, and possibly Leif, who had no discernible skill, but kept showing up with strong tea and heavier than average boots. Everyone pitched in where they could. Those who couldn't carve helped lift. Those who couldn't lift helped cook. And those who couldn't do either were politely asked to fetch more wool, chop kindling, or stand somewhere else. It was messy, imperfect, and entirely human. The longship's construction began long before the first log was felled. It started in meetings informal, shouted, possibly beer-fueled meetings where village leaders, craftsmen, and the local shipwright argued about timelines, materials, and which family's forest would provide the best timber. Decisions weren't always unanimous, but consensus mattered. The ship belonged to everyone, or at least it had better, because when the time came to push it into the sea, it was going to take every available hand and maybe a few disapproving goats to get it moving. This communal ownership wasn't just philosophical, it was baked into the materials. One family might provide the oak for the keel, another the wool for the caulking. Someone else the food for the workers, the rope from their sheep's wool, or the blacksmithing from a son-in-law who claimed to know what he was doing. The Longship was a patchwork of the community's labor, resources, and grudges, hammered together into something that might, if they were lucky, hold together longer than last year's disaster. And make no mistake, disaster was always an option. A misaligned plank could warp the hull. A weak joint could crack under pressure. A poorly cured piece of timber might split just as the ship hit open water. There was no insurance policy, no warranty, only experience, collective effort, and the quiet hope that the gods were feeling generous that season. Because cooperation was more than a virtue, it was a survival strategy. The Viking climate, if you haven't guessed by now, was not gentle. Winters were long, cruel, and suspicious of optimism. If your house wasn't airtight, you'd wake up with frost on your beard. If your ship wasn't seaworthy, you'd freeze before the wind even carried you out of the fjord. Teamwork wasn't just about efficiency, it was about warmth. Literally. People huddled together at night, sometimes next to livestock, sometimes under poorly stitched blankets, often with a resigned acceptance that personal space was a luxury no one had time for. Building together meant eating together, sleeping together, and occasionally arguing over who tracked mud onto the sealskin tarps. It also meant enduring each other's faults. Rollo had a temper. Sven was late every morning. Eric insisted on doing things the old way, which often meant slower, noisier, and more dangerous. But you didn't send them home. You didn't have that option. You adjusted. You worked around them. Because losing even one pair of hands meant more work for everyone else, and the planks weren't going to shape themselves. Sometimes the work was quiet rhythmic hammering, the rasp of a draw knife, the low murmur of voices, sharing gossip or recipes or complaints about the weather. Other times it was chaotic shouting over dropped tools, near accidents, or an especially loud debate about the correct way to bend a stubborn piece of timber. But the soundscape was always alive, always shared. Even the swearing was collaborative. And beneath it all, there was pride. Not flashy, not spoken aloud, but present in the way people showed up, day after day, to do work that was hard, thankless, and necessary. The Longship, once finished, would carry warriors, merchants, and dreams beyond the edge of the known world. But before it could do that, it had to be carved, shaped, and sealed by people who didn't care about glory only, about doing it right. Feasts marked the milestones. A completed keel meant smoked fish and flatbread by the fire. A raised mast meant ale shared in wooden cups, passed around with chapped hands and quiet grins. These moments didn't stop the work, but they punctuated it. Reminded everyone that the ship wasn't just wood and nail sit, was the result of cooperation, of hours spent side by side in cold wind and muddy boots, figuring out how to turn chaos into motion. And when the ship was finally done, when it rested on the shore like a sleeping predator, waiting to be awakened, it wasn't launched by the builder alone. It was launched by the community. Rolled over logs, guided by calloused hands, pushed into the water with cheers, prayers, and more than one person secretly hoping it wouldn't immediately sink. The moment the hull kissed the waves, everyone owned a piece of it, not because they had signed a contract, but because they had carried it, bled into it, cursed at it. If you think your modern office lacks camaraderie, try building a warship with your neighbors using nothing but shared tools, collective stubbornness, and a near-religious commitment to not freezing to death. Viking shipyards weren't efficient by modern standards. They weren't even particularly organized, but they worked, because when everyone had skin in the game, sometimes literally everyone cared about the outcome. That's the paradox of the Viking shipyard. It was chaotic, but ordered, improvised, but precise, loud, but full of silent understandings. It was where men and women, skilled and unskilled, young and old, came together to shape something bigger than themselves because they had to, and because no one else was going to do it for them. In the end, a Viking longship was more than a boat. It was a floating monument to teamwork in its rawest form. Every joint, a compromise. Every curve, a negotiation. Every completed vessel proof that survival didn't come from strength alone. It came from shared purpose, from leaning into the cold with people who were just as tired, just as determined, and just as unwilling to give up. Because if you wanted to keep your fingers come spring, you didn't need a hero. You needed a team. There's a specific kind of anxiety that comes with showing off something you've spent months, maybe years, creating. For most people, it's unveiling a painting, a manuscript, or a new haircut. For Vikings, it was dragging a 30-ton handcrafted warship across a beach and into the freezing North Sea, while the entire village watched, silently betting with their eyes whether it would float or immediately become an expensive, ceremonial crate for dead fish. This was the Viking first launch, part engineering test, part communal theatre, part mildly terrifying flirtation with fate. Because no matter how many longships had been launched before, no matter how many builders swore this one was seaworthy, and no matter how many goats had been sacrificed in its honor, there was always that final, heart-pausing moment of doubt. Did we build it right? Did we seal it well enough? Did we remember to plug that one suspicious seam near the stern? Or did we all agree, silently, not to talk about it and hope the gods weren't paying attention? The Longship launch was not just the end of a project, it was the culmination of a communal effort that began in winter and dragged on through the spring thaw, fueled by dried fish, pine tar, and blind determination. The builders had braved snow, hunger, and at least one rogue axe injury to get here. Now, the ship stood complete on the slipway, perched on wooden rollers, glinting with its final coat of tar, and daring the sea to test its resolve. Before the practical mechanics of the launch began, there was the ritual, because Vikings, while known for their pragmatism and love of sharp objects, were also profoundly superstitious. You don't sail across treacherous seas on glorified kindling without offering at least a little bribe to the universe. Launching a ship wasn't something you did casually, like pushing a canoe into a pond. It was sacred, it was symbolic, and, depending on the decade, it was bloody. A good launch needed more than strong backs and dry weather, it needed luck, which, in Viking terms, was a slippery cocktail of omens, gods, ancestral spirits, and how many ravens you saw that morning. Offerings were made. Sometimes this meant pouring ale or mead over the prow as a kind of boozy baptism. Sometimes it meant singing. Other times, when the stakes felt especially high or when the ship was expected to travel far, someone might propose a blood sacrifice. Not always human, thankfully. Often it was a sheep, a pig, or a rooster who had the misfortune of catching the wrong eye at the wrong time. Still, there are whispers, recorded in sagas, and half-remembered in archaeological hints, that some ship launches were, shall we say, less metaphorical in their offerings. A slave, a prisoner of war, or even a volunteer might be killed ritually, ceremonially, and always with the grim seriousness of people who genuinely believed this would please the gods and protect the crew. It's gruesome by modern standards, but in a world where drowning was the default cause of death at sea, you can understand the impulse to try anything. Then came the shouting. Once the rituals were complete, or at least sufficiently dramatic, it was time to move the ship. This was not a graceful process. There were no cranes, no hydraulic lifts, and certainly no OSHA regulations. Just a group of people with ropes, poles, and deeply mixed feelings about how physics actually worked. The ship sat on wooden roller slog segments, oiled with animal fat or fish guts, depending on how fancy you wanted to get. The goal was simple: push the ship down the incline and into the water without tipping it, stalling it, or accidentally crushing someone's foot beneath it. Simple goals, as it turns out, rarely translate into simple execution. The shouting began almost immediately. Instructions were barked in 6 directions at once. Someone shouted about the rope being too loose. Someone else shouted louder about it being too tight. Children were told to get back. Goats were herded away. A man was yelled at for standing in the wrong spot, then again for standing in a new, also wrong spot. The chief shipwright, normally a stoic figure, began using language that wouldn't be out of place in a thunderstorm. It was chaos but focused chaos, the kind you get when a group of people know what they're doing, but are also slightly terrified that this is the day they'll be remembered for launching a ship sideways. With enough collective strain and swearing, the ship began to move, slowly, at first, as the hull groaned and creaked, shifting weight onto the rollers. Then faster, as the pull of gravity and the push of human will turned momentum into motion. There was a sudden, electrifying moment, the point of no return, when the ship moved on its own, sliding toward the water, graceful and monstrous, like something returning to its natural element. People held their breath. The ship hit the sea with a slap and a splash, sending a shiver through the crowd. Would it float? Would it list? Would it, horror of horrors, immediately begin taking on water and confirm everyone's worst fears about that slightly warped plank they all agreed to ignore back in February? And then it floated. There's a peculiar silence that comes after a successful launch, a moment where everyone looks at each other, as if to say, did we really do that? Did we actually build something that belongs in the sea and not at the bottom of it? Relief washed over the shipyard, followed by cheers, laughter, more shouting, and probably a renewed appreciation for tar. Once afloat, the ship was tested, oars were fitted, the sail hoisted. A skeleton crew rowed it in a cautious circle, eyes scanning the waterline for leaks, listening for unnatural groans. The shipwrights walked the deck, poked seams, and muttered notes for future improvements. Every splash of water inside the hull was scrutinized like it had insulted someone's mother. But if the ship held steady, if it moved cleanly through the water, if the steering board obeyed and the mast stood true, then the ship was declared seaworthy. The prayers had worked. The teamwork had paid off. The gods, for reasons unknown, had decided not to smite anyone that day. There was always a feast after a successful launch. You don't spend months in mud, smoke, and sweat just to nod and go home. There was food bread, cheese, stews thick, with root vegetables, and bits of meat that had been saved for the occasion. Ale flowed. Stories were told. Songs were sung, some of which were actually about the ship, and some of which veered off into territories involving exaggerated heroics and suspiciously personal metaphors. People gathered around fires and recounted the process, the bent nail that nearly ruined the hull, the night the tar caught fire, the argument over whether the prow should have a dragon head or a wolf head or just a very aggressive fish, the time a goat ate part of the rigging. The small, quiet moments that only made sense to the people who had been there, who had stood side by side in the cold and done something difficult, together. And in the days that followed, the ship became more than wood and wool. It became a tool, a symbol, a character in the village's story. It would carry warriors to foreign shores, bring traders to distant markets, ferry explorers into lands only guessed at, in rumor. Its hull, stitched together by human hands, would one day hold the weight of ambition, fear, greed, and hope. But for now, it floated quietly, bobbing in the water, smelling faintly of tar and glory. If you think this is all overly dramatic for a boat, remember that for the Vikings, a ship wasn't just a mode of transport. It was the difference between isolation and connection, stagnation and opportunity, survival and death. Launching a ship wasn't just logistical, it was spiritual. It was the moment when the land-bound effort turned into something alive. And yes, sometimes it sank anyway. Sometimes all the planning, praying, and pig blood in the world couldn't prevent a bad build from revealing itself at sea. But even those failures had their place. They taught lessons. They were whispered about, turned into cautionary tales, woven into the long, smoky fabric of communal memory. Because every launch, successful or not, came down to the same thing: belief, in wood, in skill, in each other. in the idea that humans, through sheer will and careful superstition, could take something heavy, angular, and entirely unnatural and make it dance across the sea. And when it did, when the ship cut through the water and the crowd exhaled in unison, what they felt wasn't just relief. It was awe, the quiet, persistent awe of knowing that sometimes, when everything lines you effort, chance, blood, and pine tar you, really can build something that floats. There's a certain poetic satisfaction in knowing that some of the most feared naval forces in history were born not in lavish shipyards or under imperial decree, but in muddy Scandinavian clearings, with frostbitten men in damp tunics swearing at pine sap. It's one of those delightful historical ironies. The Longship, that sleek, ominous spear slicing through the sea, wasn't the product of centralized power or royal fleets. It was the result of chapped hands, communal stubbornness, and a working relationship with wood that bordered on religious. Because the Viking longship wasn't just a boat, it was an idea with oars, an argument on water, a symbol of motion when the rest of the world was still learning how not to drown in coastal fog. It took everything that life in the north demanded: resilience, adaptability, deep-seated pessimism about the weather, and turned it into a machine for mobility. And then it took that machine, pointed it at the rest of Europe, and said, more or less, let's see what breaks first. To understand what that ship meant to the world, you have to first understand what it meant at home. In the fjords of Norway, the bays of Denmark, the icy river mouths of Sweden, the Longship was more than transport. It was status, technology, and community, all lashed together with wool and iron. It was a portable expression of possibility, not just a way out, but a way forward. In a landscape that hemmed you in with mountains, sea, and months of darkness, the ship was how you expanded your world beyond what the horizon grudgingly allowed. Unlike the clunky, high-sided ships of their contemporaries, designed more to float near places than to explore beyond them, Viking longships were light, fast, and weirdly democratic. They could be rowed or sailed. They could sneak up rivers or sprint across open seas. They could land on beaches instead of docks, and more importantly, they could leave without asking permission. That alone was revolutionary. Most ships required harbors. Viking ships required opportunity. This wasn't just convenient, it was transformative. With a shallow draft and symmetrical hull, the Longship turned the Vikings into the great unscheduled guests of the medieval world. They showed up when no one expected them: up the Seine, along the Volga, into the Irish Sea, and deep into the North Atlantic. They didn't wait for borders to be opened or for trading posts to be established. They brought their boat to your door, and whether they were there to trade, raid, or accidentally settle, they had the strategic advantage of mobility and plausible deniability. And this was made possible not by size or brute force, but by design. The Longship was narrow and flexible, with a keel that let it cut through water like a knife through old stew. It could carry warriors, cargo, livestock, even family members. It could glide silently through fog or thunder forward under sail. It could be beached in minutes and relaunched just as fast. In short, it was everything a restless, overachieving, seafaring culture could want in a boat. Now, this didn't go unnoticed. To the rest of Europe, the Longship was the first thing you saw before your village stopped existing. It arrived like an omen, sleek, dark, and full of men who did not come for sightseeing. No other silhouette spread quite the same sense of dread. The dragon-headed prow wasn't just decorative, it was psychological warfare. Imagine seeing that gliding through the mist at dawn, 30 oars slicing the river like a warning from the gods. By the time you realized what was happening, the raiders were already at your granary, politely removing all your valuables. But the ship wasn't just about violence, it was about presence. It allowed the Norse to project power far beyond their icy homestead: Iceland, Greenland, England, Ireland, even parts of modern-day Turkey and Canada. Yes, Canada. Before Columbus was a glint in Genoa's eye, Viking ships had made it to Newfoundland, landing in a place they called Vinland. Possibly because cold, but edible bushland didn't have quite the same marketing appeal. And when they weren't raiding or exploring, they were trading. Viking merchants paddled their longships down Russian rivers, linked trade networks from Baghdad to Byzantium, and hauled everything from furs to slaves to amber. That same ship that served as a mobile weapon platform could also carry barrels of wine, sacks of silver, or carved walrus ivory. It was multi-purpose, much like a Swiss army knife, if the knife could also terrify coastal settlements and make a decent profit on foreign textiles. In effect, the Longship turned the Vikings from isolated tribes into a global force, not because they had more people or better weapons, but because they could move fast, everywhere, at will. It was their version of asymmetrical warfare. While other cultures built castles and waited, the Vikings built boats and arrived. This capability rippled across the continent. Kings took notice. Fortifications changed. Coastal defenses were rethought. Entire systems of taxation were invented just to pay off Vikings not to show up. If you think that sounds suspiciously like protection money, you're not wrong. The Longship forced other powers to adapt, not just to the physical threat of raids, but to the concept of mobility as strategy. And all of that came from those long winters back home, those freezing mornings spent carving wood by firelight, hammering rivets in smoke-filled huts, wrapping wool into rope and pretending it wasn't soaked in sheep grease. Every innovation, every elegant line of that hull was born out of necessity, not luxury. Vikings didn't build sleek ships because they wanted to. They built them because they had to. The land offered limits. The sea offered options. But the real genius of the Longship wasn't just in how it moved, it was in what it enabled. Because once you had a ship that could go anywhere, anywhere became an option. You weren't bound by geography or inheritance. You could raid, yes, but you could also explore, settle, trade, and return. The Longship wasn't just a vehicle, it was a philosophy, a floating invitation to try your luck elsewhere, to seek, to risk, to wander, and then to come back with stories and preferably plunder. That's why longships were buried with their owners, why they were honored, named, and sometimes set aflame on pyres like noble beasts. They weren't just tools, they were companions. You don't drag something through the surf, across the Baltic, and up a river into the heart of France, without forming a bond. The ship was your weapon, your shield, your home. It carried your ambitions as much as it carried your oars. And unlike so many historical innovations, the Longship wasn't quickly replaced. It had longevity. Variants of the design endured for centuries, evolving but recognizable, always honoring that original combination of simplicity, flexibility, and pure maritime audacity. Even today, when replicas are built for museums or reenactments, people still marvel at how efficient they are, because some ideas, once forged in fire and salted wood, don't need modernizing. They just need remembering. If you think the Vikings left behind sagas and settlements and skull-battered relics, you'd be right. But what they really left was the blueprint for an idea that if you build the right ship, you can go anywhere. That technology isn't just about mechanics, it's about intent. And that sometimes, if you start in a fjord with frozen hands and bad weather, you can still change the world with a boat that refuses to wait for a harbor. So next time you see a Longship on a postcard, in a museum, etched into a history book, don't just admire the craftsmanship. Remember the hands that built it, the wool soaked in tar, the nights spent singing while bending planks by firelight, the people who stared out over the dark sea and thought, let's try over there, and then did.